Corruption in rich countries is a different ball game to corruption in poor countries. People who live in rich countries, like Korea, like Australia, can go about their daily life without the fear of being shaken down by bureaucrats, by officials, and so on and so forth. Corruption isn't part of their everyday life. But the sorts of things that affect richer countries are much bigger questions of vote buying, capturing policies, the structure of lobbying, and so on and so forth. And these can distort policy outcomes. However, in poor countries, people do live in fear. They can't get their kids into school without paying a bribe. They can't see the doctor without paying a bribe. And so there's a whole range of things, but bribery is only one part of corruption. And bribery is not the sort of corruption we generally see in rich countries. We see things like conflict of interest. We see things like political manipulation. They're the differences to the bribery and extortion that dominate poor country corruption. And then there's another dimension, because poor countries, in many cases, are recipients of foreign aid. And the foreign aid that comes in is often misappropriated, is often not used for the purposes for which it was given. So these are the sorts of differences. Transparency is important whichever way you go. Lobbying itself, whether you have a rule or a law about it, doesn't make a lot of difference. People still represent interests, and part of any democratic society is the representation of interests. The question is, when does that representation of interests cross a line and become manipulation and pay to play and things like that? Whether you have a law or not is not the main thing. What is important is the proper exercise of representation of interests. In the United States, which is the great lobbying capital of the world, billions and billions of dollars are spent on lobbyists. In many cases, politicians in a democratic society are bought. Everything is on the register. They say they got this money from this one and that money from this one, and they went into their campaign funds. But the really difficult thing there is, what is the effect of it? In a lot of ways, the lobbying doesn't just buy the outcomes, it often buys the process as well. Public services are strapped, civil servants, there aren't as many as there used to be. They don't always have the policy skills, and so the lobbyists can help by writing the legislation. They can help by influencing in a lot of ways, and in this way, very often, the policy outcomes are distorted. So having a law isn't what it's about how transparent is the process and who really makes the decisions. The control of corruption is bigger than government alone. Government can write laws, but the laws aren't always implemented. But civil society has a huge role to play. Some of the major anti-corruption civil society groups around the world, the big ones like Transparency International and Global Witness, have had a profound impact. And they have changed the game. They've changed the way people see the issues. They've changed the way people have developed data. They've changed the way people look at accountability. And they do this by a strong act of representation, by delivering information, by pointing out inconsistencies, by pointing out problems. And so while we look at accountability, sometimes we look at accountability of the elected officials to the voters. Sometimes we look at it across government. But a third form of accountability is really the way in which civil society can hold all parts of decision-making to account, not only government, but also the private sector. We see civil society activists in the environmental area, we see them in the health area, and they point out the things that governments often don't see. Well, companies that do the wrong thing lose money. They don't always make money. There have been studies that show that companies that don't pay bribes are more profitable than companies that do pay bribes. But it's not just the payment of bribes, it's the whole structure of where they fit into the society. We've seen some massive scandals with big multinational companies. The German multinational Siemens systematically engaged in a bribery campaign around the world for 30 or 40 years. It was built into the culture of the company. Money was allocated, the board agreed, and then when they were found out, they were fined almost $2 billion US. And then Siemens changed their culture. They put another $1 billion into anti-corruption programs, educational programs, and the analysis that's taken place has showed that the Siemens products were pretty good and would have sold on their merits and on their quality. And as some people in Siemens said, if only the money that went in bribes went into our research and development, we would have had even better products. But they changed their culture. Now, another German company, Volkswagen, is involved in a monumental scandal at the moment about rigging emissions standards, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And this again is a company culture. It was tolerated, it was done to get ahead, and the analysis that is shown, that is showing what's been happening with Volkswagen has shown that this is going to hit their bottom line something terrible. Their shares have lost a huge amount of value. The largest construction company in Brazil has been systematically engaged in a bribery campaign. It's brought down politicians, the president of Brazil, and a whole lot. So these are big companies now, and big companies that think they're above the law and are too big to fail will find that they will be prosecuted and will face consequences. Smaller companies are in a different sort of situation, but to a very large extent, there are many, many laws that prohibit corrupt behaviour. Most companies do comply, and it makes everybody better off.